There are two and only two ways of attaining wealth in society: A, by production and voluntary exchange with others, the method of the free market, and B, by violent expropriation of the wealth produced by others. The latter is the method of violence and theft. The former benefits all parties involved. The latter parasitically benefits the looting group or class at the expense of the looted. Welcome to Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone. Today we have Carden, the author of Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich: How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World, published by the American Institute for Economic Research. He is a professor of economics at Brock School of Business at Samford University. Yes, Mr. Carden, did I say something incorrect?
Yeah, it turns out the book is actually from the University of Chicago Press.
I apologize. I'm getting my books mixed up.
No, no worries. No worries. I hope to have something coming out from AIER either later this year or early next year.
Okay. All right. I must have mixed those up. Either way,
I understand.
In the description below to both Mr. Carden's website along with the Amazon link. Mr. Carden, what is the Great Enrichment?
So the Great Enrichment is the movement from basically everybody being super duper poor. I mean, we're talking about per capita income of about $3 a day in roughly modern prices, to people in the Western world, in Europe, the overseas extensions of Europe, places like the United States. People are living on $100 a day and more, and even worldwide, people are living on some $30 a day. So we've gone from a world in which everybody lives lives that are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, to a world in which we live lives that are much richer, much better connected, that are much cleaner, that are much healthier, and that are much longer.
And what is the bourgeois deal?
The bourgeois deal basically says, leave me alone and I'll make you rich. What happened in order to create the Great Enrichment was that, particularly in Europe again, or it started in Europe, people began to embrace innovation and exchange in ways that they hadn't previously. And where they didn't really embrace it, they at least tolerated it just a little bit more. So we stopped executing people for coming up with what we thought were or what we would today think of as really new, interesting ideas. And we started actually to see this as something that was noble, almost, as something that was dignified, that living a life of bourgeois sobriety and prudence became something kind of honorable. And I say kind of honorable because there's much ruin, or there's a great deal of ruin in a nation and a great deal of ruin in pretty much any society. It became just enough, or we started to acknowledge and appreciate innovators like, people like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, for example, just enough for it to really set things ripping. And we became extremely wealthy. What we're observing now is the largest mass movement of people out of extreme poverty in the history of the species, as countries like China and India begin to adopt the bourgeois deal and basically leave people alone to innovate and leave people alone to exchange.
So, in short, the reason that some countries are wealthy and others are impoverished is the impoverished nations have not left people alone. Is that more or less the thesis?
That's part of it. That's a big part of it. So there's a lot that's going on. There are a lot of necessary conditions for economic growth, like secure property rights and things like that, that a lot of poor countries are still struggling with. But even once you have those things, you still need a cultural and rhetorical environment that leaves people alone. You still need a cultural and rhetorical environment that says basically you're not allowed to tread on anybody. And if we're not allowed to tread on anybody, or if we say it's wrong to tread on other people, then those people on whom we are no longer treading are going to make us rich by coming up with cool new stuff.
Now, does the absence of one institution treading, let's call it the state, does that allow for people in industries to, let's say, take advantage of people who are in a less wealthy economic state, just as a strong person can take advantage of a weak person, a wealthy person could take advantage of someone impoverished? Is this a shortcoming in the free market advocacy?
I don't think it is. Because if only we could all be taken advantage of as routinely as the as people in the free market, quote unquote, take advantage of us. I think Sheldon Richman he used to be with the Foundation for Economic Education. Once he posted something on Facebook that stuck with me. He said, just because people can't be trusted with liberty doesn't mean they can be trusted with power. And I think the taking advantage of tends to happen politically far more than it happens commercially. So the Justice Department, for example, just went after Google, and they're arguing that Google is an evil monopolist that's exploiting people, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I switched for a short period of time. I switched my default web browser from Google to something else, which was incredibly easy to do. And I ended up switching back to Google just because Google offers, in my humble opinion, a better product when it comes to search and things like that. To the extent that Google is taking advantage of me, again, like I said, I wish the state took advantage of me in that way. I wish that they took advantage of me by providing me with amazingly high quality technology and services that didn't exist, 30 years ago, at a price of effectively, to me at least, zero. The state unfortunately doesn't do that, and it's the treading on that happens that is a real problem.
Now, how can we measure wealth or standard of living?
Yeah, so the typical measure of wealth, or the typical measure of income, is gross domestic product. So I'm teaching principles of macro this semester, so my students should all know that gross domestic product is the market value of all finished goods and services produced in a country in a year. In other words, it's a measure of total value added in the economy. And it has a lot of problems and a lot of imperfections, but it's quite literally good enough for government work. And it's good enough for the kind of long-term comparison that we're trying to do here, where at least to the order of magnitude, it's sort of accurate. Whether it was a 900% change or a 1,000% change or an 1,100% change is kind of secondary to the fact that it was just a really, really, really big change. And when we think about our scope for material and spiritual flourishing, it's greater now than it has ever been, and it's because, again, we basically stopped treading on others, or we didn't tread on each other as much. And again, like I said, the fact that we're not sticking boots in the faces of people who have cool or have interesting new ideas helps to explain why, again, we're living lives that are healthy, wealthy, wise-ish, and generally, again, better than anything that has ever come before.
Does allowing people to exist in a free market, I hate to say the word allowing, it assumes that the state has the default rule on society.
Right.
Does embracing free market principles lead to a lack of spirituality, as in much more materialism? People are obsessed with their job, getting the next dollar, becoming as rich as their neighbor, keeping up with the Joneses, thus depriving us of the dignity of what really makes us human.
Yeah, so that's a really fascinating question, and it's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think the evidence suggests that embracing free markets does not mean embracing materialism. It doesn't mean embracing sort of lives of spiritual poverty, where again we're waiting for the next dollar, or we're looking for the next donut, or what have you. A lot of empirical evidence suggests that societies the more exposed societies are to market norms, the more likely they are to develop generalized social trust and things like that. So people become actually less materialistic in free societies than in unfree societies. And part of that is there's a sense in which a lot of the kind of spiritual and moral niceties that we enjoy today are luxury goods, in a sense. Like if you're worried about, if you're on the brink of starvation, for example, then complex ethical reflection may not be something that you have a whole lot of free time and energy for, because because the other person, the other person who's trying to hunt the deer that you're trying to get is a rival, and if they get the deer, you don't, and you die. So I think the evidence suggests that we live much better lives. In the 18th century, people developed this idea of commerce as a sort of a moderating and sweetening and gentling uh, set of ideas or set of rules. And I think we're actually not just richer, but we're better as a result of the increased scope that the bourgeois deal has given us.
It's interesting. You ask people, how should we regulate ideas or what books you can read? And they go, well, that's terrible. I mean, as much as it's good to stop evil ideas from spreading, that's too much power in the hands of a few and it would stop the innovators. They don't take that principle and apply it to the commercial sector.
Right.
How is it that this double standard is able to exist in the mind of not only the average person, but in so many academics as well?
Again, I think it's a fantastic question. And for a lot of people, for a bunch of reasons, many of which have to do with sort of like deep historical anthropology that I'm not really qualified to address, we tend to have a zero-sum worldview, or we tend to think that if I've got something, it's because I took it from somebody else, or if somebody else has something, it's because they took it from somebody else, or it's because we spend our formative years in a family that runs according to what are fundamentally socialist principles, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. I have 3 kids at home, and we don't run our domestic life on the basis of market norms. For example, there's not going to be a bidding war over who gets the mashed potatoes at dinner tonight. It's very, very simple. We earn my wife and I earn the money and provide the food and the clothing and the shelter and the things like that. And I think for a lot of people, they look at this model of the family and say, wouldn't it be nice if a broader society of 330 million people, which is roughly the American population, were operated in much the same way? And it's also very, very easy to look at what is in some sense very true in the short run, which is that, well, if I saw somebody who was hungry and I just gave them some food, they would no longer be hungry anymore. And it's a lot harder to think about the systemic characteristics of the social processes that have helped us to make poverty history. And I think we tend erroneously to focus on distribution in the short run rather than production in the long run.
Could the idea of leaving people alone, not using the state to initiate aggression against peaceful actors, let's just say, could that lead to people thinking very short term and as opposed to thinking long term? In other words, I'll pollute the environment because I'm a guy who just wants to get rich. I only got a few years left to live. The ozone layer thing probably isn't true, so I'm just going to exploit everything I have in the here and now, screw future generations because I don't have any regulation upon me.
That's possible, but not plausible. I understand the story, and I understand where people are kind of coming from, but this again is sort of the beauty of a commercial society. Is in a commercial society where people are voluntarily exchanging secure private property rights in a system that's governed by the rule of law and an ethical consensus, you end up on the hook for the damage that you create. So a lot of the environmental problems that we look at are not problems of, so people tend to be very, very short-sighted because they have incentives to be short-sighted. It's, in many cases, a problem stemming from the fact that we haven't created or we haven't recognized private property rights over this particular piece of land or that particular bit of air or what have you. And we end up in fact actually compounding these problems by failing to establish rights that would allow markets to solve the problem. Then there's also a relatively there's a somewhat uncomfortable point here too, which is that it's not clear that a lot of what economists call externalities, which are spillover benefits or spillover costs that we convey onto others. It's not really clear that a lot of those are relevant or not already dealt with. So to use an example, we moved this past week, and we moved to a new neighborhood, and lo and behold, it turns out that there are a lot of bars and concert venues near our new place that involve a decent amount of noise. And a very, very narrow analysis would say, oh, well, we're being imposed upon by the bars and restaurants and whatnot that are creating this noise. but the disutility or the problems for us created by the noise, this was already capitalized into the fact that we got a pretty good deal on the house. So I'm not 100%. The question about whether or not we're going to be short run focused and running roughshod over everybody else is, I think, a lot more complex than it at first appears.
Yeah, I would also say that the noise caused by the mass murdering campaigns that governments engage in all over the world, that noise also bothers me. So the existence of noise does not justify state involvement. What I really like about in a analysis I read of your book on the Cato Institute, I believe it was you talked about a number of things that were necessary but not sufficient, which we went over previously. You also talk about things that, while they exist, they're not an explanation. For example, slavery and colonialism. So if I'm looking at these, I'll say, well, slavery, this is low-cost labor that allows you to really pump out a lot of stuff from people involuntarily, and you just colonize nations against their consent. Therefore, slavery and colonialism really are the reason that the West grew rich. How do you respond?
Yeah, so that too is really interesting in light of the fact that these are first of all popular theses, and second of all things that are taking more political importance. First of all, it's certainly not the case that slavery was free labor, nor is it really the case that slavery was cheap labor. Slaves, first of all, so abstracting from a second, and I want to be very, 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 very clear about this, because for whatever reason, people tend not to hear this part of the argument. There is absolutely no moral or economic case for slavery. It is morally unexcusable, and it is, as we say in the book, it is economically stupid. Slavery, colonialism, imperialism, we argue, are economically stupid. In addition to being horrifically immoral. But the use of a slave is, first of all, something that has an opportunity cost, because using a slave to pick cotton means that you're not using the slave to do something else. Moreover, the care and feeding of slaves was a very, very expensive process. Slave upkeep, required food, clothing, shelter, etc. And the rate of return on slave ownership was really not that high. Okay, rate of return on slave ownership was really not that high, and if there were extraordinary profits to be made in the slave trade, those would have gone to the people who did the capturing of the eventual slaves in the African interior. Past that point, slaves would have just earned a normal rate of return. So that helps to explain, I think, why slavery itself is not going to do a whole lot to explain why people in some places are very rich today. Moreover, slavery is historically universal. Slavery has existed in virtually every human society since the dawn of time. Sometimes, in the early 19th century, it was referred to as the South's peculiar institution. But as I've said, I think in several places, that if there is historically a truly peculiar institution, it's been free labor. Slavery, again, has existed in the United States. It's existed in South America. The number of Africans transported to South America is a multiple of the number of Africans that were transported to North America. The Indian Ocean slave trade was enormous. In fact, more Europeans were captured and sold into slavery along the north coast of Africa than were transported to North America. So if slavery per se explains prosperity, then prosperity would have happened eons ago somewhere other than Western Europe and the United States. If people say, well, it's slavery plus capitalism, that kind of gives away the game and basically says, well, it's the institutions of an innovating free market society and not slavery. So what's interesting, and I think the final conclusion that we have to reach about slavery is we had something that was unambiguously wicked by any standard. This is a horrible, awful, evil, terrible thing, and we don't even have an industrial revolution to show for it. In fact, we're poorer today because of the Atlantic slave trade, because of the Indian Ocean slave trade, because of the Caribbean slave trade, because of slavery, because this was a thing that humans did to each other, we today have lower standards of living than we otherwise would have.
Excellent point. Yes, I had philosopher James Harrigan on last week, and we talked about how there is a legal code going back to the year 2100 BC, and the primary focus is slavery and how to treat your slave, what you can and can't do, and that's from Mesopotamia. So it's totally bizarre that that's what they pick out. Is state regulation, the initiation of coercion against employers, necessary for the safety and well-being of an individual in their capacity as a worker?
No, it absolutely is not, because markets are competitive. And this is one of the stories, again, that a lot of people heard in high school history, that working conditions were terrible and people were exploited. And then the unions came along and they wrote some really great songs, and they did. And then they sang these songs, and then as a result of the labor movement, government stepped in and regulated wages and working conditions and made child labor a thing in the past and stuff like that. But again, what killed child labor and what has created safe workplaces has not been government regulation, but increasing productivity. And we have chosen to spend some of our increased productivity in safer workplaces, in more workplace amenities, and in not sending our children into the workforce when they're young. So child labor was on its way out, and workplace safety was increasing well before the government got involved. And in a lot of cases, the regulations that governments passed were basically formalizations and codifications of things that businesses were already doing and things that workers were already doing. I don't know that there's a ton of work on this specifically, but it's much, I think that the history of regulation in the early 20th century, or the history of the regulation of labor markets specifically in the early 20th century, is much more consistent with a model in which firms and workers are looking for a way to disadvantage their competitors. And they're able to do this by getting the government to make it obligatory for anyone who wishes to enter the industry to do what incumbent firms are already doing.
Now, forget about me as a worker. Just imagine I am a consumer. I have no clue when I look at a piece of meat whether that is healthy or it's going to kill me. I have no clue if Mark Thornton, author of The Quotable Mises, just has a bunch of blank pages in here. Fortunately, I have political representatives who I have voted for who are terrified of me voting them out. Therefore, the existence of a state, an interventionist state, is justified on behalf of keeping me safe in my capacity as a consumer, in opposition to those trying to exploit, take advantage of me, and take my money and run.
Okay, that's possible. Or you could just ask someone who knows Mark Thornton whether or not he's reliable. I know Mark and would argue that he's a pretty reliable guy. So if I were to buy one of Mark's books, I would be shocked to get just a bunch of blank pages. Reputation mechanisms work really, really, really well. They work really, really well. Just to use a couple of examples. Well, let me think about how I want to put this. First, reputation mechanisms work really, really well. You know more or less what you're getting when you go to a Waffle House, say. Or you know more or less what you're getting when you go to Taco Bell or Chick-fil-A or something like that. And firms spend a lot of time and a lot of energy protecting their reputations. Now then, you might have a problem, or a company might have a problem where there's some sort of scandal like an E. coli outbreak or something to that effect. This has happened at several restaurants. And I'm thinking of a couple in particular, one that I've actually never been to because when I was in 6th grade, there was an E. coli outbreak at this particular fast food chain. And even when I've been in places where that fast food chain does business, every time I see their sign, I think E. coli because of something that happened when I was in 6th grade. And then there's another chain that had an E. coli scandal or an E. coli outbreak again recently, just several years ago, that I've been to a few times since then, but it's not the first place that comes to mind when I think, I want fast food, in part because that's always going to be sort of lingering there. They still exist, of course, but they're not nearly as profitable, probably, as they otherwise would have been had they not had this E. coli problem to begin with. There's also a question of trade-offs that is, I think, really relevant and really important. People might be willing to trade off quality and risk in exchange for lower prices. And it doesn't seem like it is the prerogative of the state to prevent people from making those choices. Much as, so I drive a 2012 Toyota Corolla. Corolla? Camry? I don't know. 2012 Toyota something or other. And I mean, it's a decent enough car, but I would presumably be so much safer if I drove a Saab, or if I drove a Volvo, or if I drove a Mercedes. Well, I'm willing to accept the disamenities and the trade-offs that come with driving a 2012 Toyota, in order to have a lower price, lower cost of operation, things like that. In much the same way that when I go to some places that are that don't have the same reputation for cleanliness as Chick-fil-A does, say, I know that I'm maybe taking a bit of a risk, or maybe I'm eating in a not so nice environment, but I'm willing to do that in order to save a few bucks. And no one has the right, I think, to tread on me and tell me that I'm making the wrong choice.
Sure. As far as the principal difference between using the mechanism of the state and the mechanism of the free market to achieve your ends, what would you say is the principal difference between those two mechanisms in hopes of, getting health care or, achieving any end you have in life?
Violence. The key difference is violence. And people don't like to hear that, I guess, but that's the difference between the state and any other organization. The state has guns and cages, and Walmart doesn't. So if I don't want to shop at Walmart, then I can just go to Target, which is right down the street. And Walmart cannot compel me to do business in their store. If I choose not to pay taxes, if I say to the IRS, I appreciate the national defense and all this other stuff, but I would much rather buy from a different provider. They're going to have a very different view of things. If we want cable TV service, or if we want the internet or something like that, again, the company that we switched providers when we moved last week. The company we switched from, they can't show up at our house with a gun and a warrant and say, okay, give us money and take our product, or we will lock you in a cage. And that is fundamentally the difference between how you elicit or how you get cooperation how you get cooperation if you're the state versus how you get cooperation if you're operating the market. The state can get people to cooperate. It can get people to acquiesce. Otherwise, do because the way you get to do what you want is to make them better off, however they choose to define it. So in a very famous passage in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith talks about how we don't talk to the butcher, the baker, and the brewer about what we need. We talk about how we can make their lives better. And some people interpret this as sort of an apology for untrammeled greed, in the way that we try to teach our kids not to behave. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think what Smith is doing in that passage is he's recognizing that there's an infinite number of ways we could use our time, and there's an infinite number of ways we could help people. We have to find some way to choose who we help and who we don't, or to choose who gets our time and attention and who doesn't. And as Smith points out, what's evolved in a market is if I want to get the butcher, the baker, and the brewer to provide me with a meal, it's insufficient for me to point at my hungry children, because everyone's got hungry children. What I need to do is find a way to help the butcher, the baker, and the brewer feed their own children in order to secure their cooperation in feeding mine.
Excellent. Mr. Carden, thank you so much for your time. I just have two more quick questions for you. A lot of criticism of the free market is not unique to the free market. For example, there is greed and there is dog eat dog competition, and it can disrupt and disorder, and there's no guarantee of my safety.
Mhm.
Well, that all applies tenfold to the state because you can't
Yes.
opt out of funding them and they have no competition.
Mhm.
Do you think there's anything that uniquely applies negatively to the free market that justifies the existence of a state?
I really don't think there is. I really don't think there is. I'm I tend to believe that states are kind of inevitable in that there's always going to be an organization with a comparative advantage in violence, which is kind of the way that my advisor defined a state when I was in graduate school. But I don't think it's necessary. Sort of like the song in The Sound of Music, where the girl's singing, "Anything you can do, I can do better." I would say anything states can do, markets do better. Um, and I don't think the state is necessary for any of the problems that we want to fix, or any of the problems that we want to solve. I think the last 4 years have been a really nice illustration of the difference between the market and the state. When you consider the administration of Donald Trump, and a lot of people are horrified at Donald Trump as just a crass human being who is an opportunist. I mean, assume for the sake of argument that everything everybody says about Trump is right, that he's the worst of the worst. Okay, well, would you prefer a world in which he's doing suspect real estate deals in New Jersey and New York to a world in which he has his finger on the nuclear button? And I think the answer is yes. I would much rather Donald Trump confine his efforts to trying to make money in the real estate market, rather than trying to make America great again by pursuing all sorts of boneheaded policies like immigration restrictions and tariffs.
Yeah, it's the perfect falsifiable analogy. Um, Now, final question. When
Uh-huh.
you and I met many moons ago at the IHS, gosh, what was it? It was their annual meetup in Arizona.
Oh, cool.
You were
Okay.
wearing this really cool Adam Smith tie. I'm curious, what are the best lessons you learned from the works of Adam Smith? If the best lesson is the one you gave us earlier, please give us the second best.
Okay, so the best lessons and second best lessons. So one really good lesson I learned is don't leave your Adam Smith tie on a plane because you'll never see it again.
No, you didn't.
I did. Um, yeah, so I think I think the best lesson that we can take from Adam Smith is his local knowledge argument, and that is his argument that, kind of, I'm paraphrasing him a little bit. He says everybody in their local situation knows better than an external observer how to handle that situation. So, just quickly, okay. So, how many kids do I have? Okay, so I'm asking you.
Three?
Three. Okay, I do have three kids. How old are they?
I don't know. You just mentioned three earlier, so I have no
Okay.
clue.
Okay. Okay. Good. So you're a good listener. Okay. So you don't even know how old my kids are. So how so what? It seems absurd to say that you're going to be in a good position to make consequential decisions about how I live my life and about how I raise my children. Um, and it's not that you're a bad person. Certainly, it's just that you lack the local knowledge that's necessary. Um, and I think this is an important insight that we get from Smith. Part of the value of a free society, and of course Hayek elaborates on this in the 20th century. Part of the value of free society is that it allows us to harness and deploy knowledge we don't have for purposes other people may not understand and may not even approve of.
Mr. Carden, thank you so much for your time. The book is Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World. Sir, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone for watching. Keith and I don't tread on anyone.
Thank you.